Have you ever met someone who just lets people be wrong about them? Someone says something completely off about who they are, what they meant, or what they did. And instead of defending themselves, they just go quiet. Maybe they say something like, think what you want, or it doesn't matter, and move on. From the outside, that can look like confidence. Like they're so secure in themselves that other people's opinions just don't touch them. But that's not always what's happening. Sometimes what looks like unbothered is exhausted. What looks like detachment is protection. And what looks like not caring is someone who cared so many times, got hurt so many times, that they made a decision somewhere along the way. Explaining myself is not worth the risk anymore. Today we're going to go deep on why that happens, the psychology behind it, where it comes from, and what it actually costs the person living it. Let's start with the behavior. When someone stops correcting people's perception of them, it doesn't happen overnight. It builds. It's not a choice they make on a Tuesday morning. It's a conclusion their brain arrives at after collecting enough data. The data sounds like this. I explained myself. They still didn't get it. I told them how I felt. They told me I was wrong. I corrected the story. They kept telling it the same way. After enough of those moments, the brain does what it's designed to do. It adapts. It stops investing energy in something that keeps returning nothing. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. It was first identified by Martin Seligman in the 1960s through experiments where subjects, after experiencing repeated uncontrollable outcomes, eventually stopped trying to change their situation even when they had the power to. They didn't try anymore. Not because they couldn't, because they had learned that trying doesn't work. Now apply that to human relationships. Apply that to being misunderstood over and over again. The uncontrollable outcome isn't physical pain, it's other people's perception. And when someone learns that they cannot control whether they are understood, they may stop trying to be. So where does this pattern come from? Because nobody is born like this. For a lot of people, it starts early. In childhood, when a person is still figuring out how emotions work, how relationships work, how they work, they look to the adults around them for feedback. And if that feedback sounds like, you're overreacting, that's not what happened. Stop being so sensitive. Why do you always make everything dramatic? Something quietly breaks. Because the child isn't just learning, I was wrong about this situation. They're learning something deeper. My internal experience is not trustworthy. What I feel is not real. What I say will not be believed. Research on childhood emotional invalidation consistently links it to emotional inhibition in adulthood. Meaning, people who grew up having their feelings dismissed learn to suppress those feelings before they even come out. They edit themselves before they speak. They pre-reject their own experience before someone else can do it. So by the time they're an adult, the habit of staying quiet, of not correcting people, of not explaining themselves, it's already been practiced for years. It didn't feel like a habit. It felt like survival. Now, layer on top of that, rejection sensitivity. Psychologists Geraldine Downey and Scott Feldman describe rejection-sensitive people as those who anxiously expect, rapidly perceive, and overreact to rejection. And here's what's important. The rejection doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be someone screaming at you or cutting you off completely. It can be an eye roll, a sigh, someone walking away mid-explanation, someone saying, yeah, okay, in a tone that means they don't believe you. For someone with high rejection sensitivity, those small moments register like alarms. And over time, their brain starts running a cost-benefit analysis before any interaction. If I correct this person, will they get defensive? Will they think I'm making excuses? Will they use this against me? Is it worth it? And eventually, the answer the brain keeps landing on is no. The risk is too high. The potential pain of being rejected while trying to be understood is worse than just letting the misunderstanding stand. So, they go quiet. And people read the quiet as confidence. But inside, it's closer to self-protection. There's another layer to this, and it goes even deeper. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by researchers like Mary Ainsworth, tells us that the early relationships we have, especially with caregivers, create what are called internal working models. These are essentially mental blueprints, templates the brain builds to answer questions like, are people safe? Are they reliable? If I need something, will someone show up? If someone grew up in an environment where people were emotionally unavailable, where vulnerability was ignored, or worse, used against them, their internal working model looks like this. People don't really listen. People have already decided who I am. Opening up leads to being hurt. And here's what makes this so powerful and so painful. These models operate mostly below the surface. The person isn't consciously thinking, I have an insecure attachment style. They just feel it as a quiet knowing. Why bother explaining? They've already made up their mind. That feeling isn't irrational. It's the brain being loyal to the lessons it was taught. There's one more piece I want to talk about. And this one doesn't always get named: impression fatigue. Impression management is the ongoing process of trying to control how other people perceive you. And most people do this every single day. Choosing their words carefully, explaining their intentions, correcting misunderstandings. But for someone who has spent years feeling chronically misunderstood, this process becomes exhausting in a specific way. Because, no matter how carefully they explain, people still interpret things through their own lens, their own biases, their own past experiences. And at some point, the person realizes, I can explain perfectly and still be misunderstood. I can do everything right and people will still talk. I can show up and still be seen wrong. So they stop managing the impression, not because they stopped caring about being seen, but because they finally accepted that they cannot control it. And accepting that, while painful, is actually a form of clarity. The thought becomes, your perception of me is yours. I'm done making myself responsible for it. Here's what I want you to really sit with though, because this is the part people miss. This adaptation has a cost. When you stop correcting people's perception of you, you protect yourself from rejection. But you also stop being known. And being known, truly seen by another person, is one of the deepest human needs we have. So the protection that felt like freedom slowly becomes a kind of quiet isolation. The person is still in the room, still in the relationship. But there's a version of them that nobody gets to reach anymore, because they learned it wasn't safe to let anyone in that far. Some people carry a grief about this that they don't even have words for. A loneliness that exists even in rooms full of people. Because they want to be understood. They've always wanted that, but they've lost faith that it's possible. And that is the real wound underneath the detachment. So the next time you see someone who lets people be wrong about them, who doesn't defend themselves, who just goes quiet, understand what you might actually be looking at. You might be looking at someone who explained themselves 100 times and got hurt 100 times. Someone whose brain learned that being seen correctly requires two people, one to explain and one willing to understand. They didn't give up on communication. They gave up on the hope that you were safe enough to receive them. If this resonated with you, whether you recognized yourself or someone you love, share it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone who stopped believing they could be understood is to simply show them this and say, I see you. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.